All right, so in this remembering section, we've talked about active recall, like testing ourselves is the single best thing ever. We've talked about spaced repetition, and we've talked about my retrospective revision timetable and my friend Simon's prospective spaced repetition diary/journal. We've talked about interleaving and why it's good, and we've talked about rereading and why it's bad. Let's now talk about highlighting. Now, highlighting is one of those things that we all love to do. I love carrying different colored highlighters with me because it makes me feel pro. You know, like I remember when my mum was preparing for her medical exams and I would watch her studying, she'd be like highlighting with one of these like Staedtler highlighters. And I'd see her book with like tattered pages with all highlightings everywhere and think, damn, this is what studying is supposed to look like. But unfortunately, if we look at the evidence, highlighting is not very effective. So there's that study from 2013 that I've been referencing a lot from Professor Dunlosky and his colleagues, and they looked at highlighting and all the evidence around highlighting, and they concluded that highlighting is low utility, i.e. it's not very good. There is one study from 1974 which says that active highlighting is superior to passive rereading of highlighted material. Like, you know, if you're reading stuff and you're highlighting it as you go along, that's better than just reading stuff that's already been highlighted. But then they tried to replicate that sort of in a study in 2014. And they looked at whether the isolation of an item facilitates its recall. Because I suppose when we're highlighting, at least when I'm highlighting, the idea for me is that, I'm thinking, this is an important fact. And by highlighting it, A, I'll be able to come back to it again, but B, somehow by highlighting it, maybe it'll stick out to me in my brain or something like that. At least that's what goes through my head. And so in this study from 2014, they got 4 groups of students and they, put them in different conditions. So basically they were told to highlight different things. So group number 1 was told to highlight any principles. Group number 2 was told to highlight examples of principles. Group number 3 was told to highlight trivial statements, like, random statement. And group number 4 was not supposed to highlight anything at all. Oh, actually, no, they were underlining, not highlighting, but like the principle stays the same. Like, highlighting something is basically the same as underlining it because the idea is that it isolates it from the rest of the text. And so they found that actually there was a little bit of an advantage if the students highlighted a principle and they were being tested on principles, or if they underlined an example of a principle and the test was on examples of principles. They found that there was a very slight edge, but overall they found that isolating stuff from the text by underlining overall had no effect. And that was especially true if we were looking at overall test performance, kind of which would have been on non-specifically underlined material. So what does that tell us? It tells us that highlighting is sort of useful, but it's also very low utility compared to other things that we could be doing. But having said that, I still enjoy highlighting things. So mostly if I'm reading a PDF of lecture notes on my iPad, I'll be using the app Notability, and I'll be using the Apple Pencil to highlight stuff as I go along. And there's a few different reasons why I highlight. Firstly, I personally find that highlighting helps me concentrate a little bit better. Like if I have something to do while reading, it means my mind is less likely to wander. So that's a good reason to highlight in my book. Secondly, I enjoy highlighting in different colors. Firstly, because it makes my notes look pretty, and when stuff looks pretty, I'm more likely to continue doing it and to enjoy it. But more importantly, I like to highlight different colors depending on what sort of information it is. And then I'll use those highlight colors next time I'm looking at the topic to try and create my active recall questions out of it. So for example, these days in yellow, I highlight just general stuff. In blue, I highlight something that's particularly insightful or interesting. In pink, I highlight examinable facts, which would then make for good flashcards. And in purple, I highlight experimental evidence that would be worth remembering. And so if I'm doing a teaching session and looking at the lecture notes, I can immediately see from the highlights, be like, okay, that's an examinable fact. So if I see an examinable fact, I might say to the group that I'm teaching, hey, Tom, tell me about how many joules of work the heart does in a human lifetime. And he might say, oh, it does 240 million joules of work. I'll be like, cool, well done, Tom. Because that's an examinable fact, potentially, if that sort of fact came up in our exams. Or I might say, hey, Bob, talk to me about that study that Curtis and Cole did in 1942, because I've highlighted in purple Curtis and Cole 1942, so I know it's the sort of thing that could be tested in an exam. And if I'm just studying for myself, if I'm creating flashcards or creating active recall questions the second time around after reading the thing and highlighting the thing once, then it means I can immediately see where the examinable facts are and where the studies are, so I can write, what did Hodgkin and Huxley discovered in 1939, or what did Curtis and Cole discover in 1942, or how many joules of work does the heart do in a given lifetime? So it's that sort of based on the highlighting of stuff. And while I'm highlighting, I recognize in the back of my mind, because I've spent ages sort of looking at the sort of evidence, I recognize in the back of my mind that, yeah, highlighting probably isn't effective and I should probably just be writing questions for myself. But, while you're reading, you might as well highlight as you're going along because it doesn't really cost much extra. And we're reading the stuff anyway to try and understand it. But of course, I am doing the Feynman technique of whenever I like pretty much for every line in the lecture notes, or at least at the end of every paragraph, I will be asking myself those two questions of, firstly, does this make sense? And secondly, could I explain this to a 5-year-old? So for me personally, highlighting doesn't detract from the Feynman technique and from the active recall that I'm doing. It sort of helps create active recall questions further down the line. But I think for me, the most important fact is that highlighting just helps me concentrate a little bit better and makes my notes look pretty, which means when I do a top-down Instagram shot of them, it looks like I've done a little bit of work rather than just have a blank slate. So yeah, those are my thoughts on highlighting. It's probably a bit of a waste of time, but I mean, it's nice anyway, so I still do it, and I wouldn't criticize you. I mean, I don't like criticizing anyone, but I would criticize you if you were just reading and hoping that would work. But I think if you're reading and highlighting and you've got the intention of doing Feynman technique and doing active recall and doing spaced repetition and stuff further down the line, I think in that context, there's nothing wrong with highlighting. Sorry, Professor Dunlosky. I know you say it's not very good, but I enjoy it. It's fun. Makes me feel happy. So that's highlighting. Thanks for watching and see you in the next video.